Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the Faster Project webinar panel sessions after our summer break. Hope you've had a good time. Today, we're going to be discussing, ironically, given that this is a project about putting rapid chargers in for electric vehicles, do we need private cars? What are the alternatives out there? And we've got some really interesting panelists to talk us through all of the different solutions that are available today and what will be available in the not too distant future, and also the infrastructure that's required to support that properly. But first and foremost, it's been a busy summer for the Faster project. So, Donal, I understand that there have been contracts signed, chargers in the ground. Tell us more.
Yes, Euan, thank you. Delighted to be back for our final few webinars as we enter the final phase of the Faster project. As Euan mentioned, yes, there have been contracts signed over the summer, and work in all regions is now underway on the charging network. So in Scotland, our partners at Scottish Power began work there in August, and up to last week, there were eight chargers installed across 4 sites, and that work will be continuing over the coming weeks, as there's 24 chargers to be installed across the Highlands and Islands in Western Scotland. In Northern Ireland, we announced just a fortnight ago that AECOM have been appointed by Ulster University to design, build and operate the network here in Northern Ireland. So 24 chargers will be installed again in Northern Ireland over the coming weeks, and those will be commissioned before the end of the year. So we'll have a series of single charger sites and mini hubs at council owned facilities here in Northern Ireland. And I can exclusively reveal to you all this morning that Weave have been appointed by Louth County Council to deliver the charging infrastructure in the Republic of Ireland in the 7 border counties. So we'll have chargers in counties Donegal, Leitrim, Sligo, Cavan, Monaghan, Louth and Meath. And again, all work will be completed before the project ends on the 31st of December. So it will be an incredibly busy few months ahead for all our partners on the project. We also hosted our first EV Talk Live Roadshow at the Nevis Centre on the 26th of August. On the day, we had a series of panel discussion sessions, which were hosted by Euan, Kate Turrell from ChargeSafe, and Gary McRae from Urban Foresight. And I just want to say a big thank you to everyone who came along on that day as attendees or as exhibitors. I think it was a really great event, and we're very much looking forward to the next roadshow, which takes place here at the Erin campus in Enniskillen on Saturday, the 23rd of September. So that's Saturday week, and it will run from 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. Again, we'll have a series of panel discussions and presentations on the day, which will be hosted by Andrew Benfield from Cenex and Caroline Kidd. And we'll also have Tesla, Weave, and a number of other organizations and local dealerships on the day, offering test drive opportunities in both commercial and private passenger vehicles. And we would be delighted if you can join us on the day. Tickets are free, and I'll pop the link into the chat now for anybody that would like to register. We're also working on a series of other exciting initiatives over the coming months, which will hopefully help ensure that there's a legacy for the project beyond the installation of the EV chargers. And I'll be able to provide some further updates on those over the next few webinars. Just in terms of next month we will be taking a look at the current status of the EV market and infrastructure in Scotland and the potential impact of the Faster network on public charging in Western Scotland. So do join us for that. So I will now pass you back over to Euan for the main event, and we look forward to hearing from today's guest panelists on such an interesting topic. So back to you, Euan.
Thank you, Donal. So today's topic, at the moment, we're looking at Gen Z and their kind of trends, or sorry, very American of me, Gen Z, and their trends when it comes to transport. So according to McKinsey, which is a very large global consultancy, about 50% of Gen Z people would like their next vehicle to be an EV. But that said, they're also quite open to shared mobility solutions and sustainable options. And in fact, about 55% of Gen Z people are consumers are open to sharing private vehicles. So that obviously shows an interest in shared mobility going on to kind of micro mobility as well. So on that note, do we really need private cars going forward? So what we're going to do today is we have an amazing selection of panelists lined up who I'll introduce very shortly. And we're going to be looking at alternatives to private vehicles in decreasing order of size. So we have with us today Keith Stark and Joe Parry from hiyacar. We have Grace Packard from AECOM. We have Beth Morley from Cenex, Paul Stratford from Solarcycle, and Jon Williams from Zedify. Before we go on to the first topic of the agenda today, I should point out that, as always, we've got the webinar chat for you to indulge in some engaging discussion around this wider topic. And if you have any questions for the panelists, please put them in the Q&A section rather than the chat so that we can pick up on those and answer them at the end of the webinar. But without further ado, Keith and Joe, if you'd like to switch on your cameras and your mics, the first question for you is, can we make better use of existing private vehicles that are already on the road? So I suppose that is very much playing into hiyacar's unique take on a car club. So tell us more about what you do.
Yeah, well, essentially hiyacar started as the B&B for cars. So the platform started by our founder, who was very concerned about the inefficient use of vehicles. So he decided that he should be able to share his car with he lived in a village, he should be able to share his car with his neighbors. So that's how hiyacar was essentially born. So we've developed quite a lot of technology around that since those early days. And in terms of providing an insurance solution, providing keyless access to vehicles, providing recording any damage on vehicles to allow people to share their vehicles. Because we got a lot of supply and demand issues, we got involved in providing fleet where we didn't have fleet. So we're also a COMO UK accredited car club operator. And over the last sort of year or so, Joe and I have been working very on a project to develop a pool car fleet management system, which allows organizations to share their fleets amongst each other for work purposes, but also allowing them the facility to share those vehicles with the public outside working hours and what have you.
So instead of having a dedicated car club vehicle or fleet of car club vehicles, you're taking existing pool cars and vans and so on that would otherwise be sitting at the depot not doing much, and you're allowing local residents to be able to use those outside of fleet operation hours.
Absolutely, but we're also allowing the organizations to really understand how their fleet is being used as well, because of the booking platform and all the data that we can record about how their fleet's being used, we can advise them on the number of cars, because within large organizations there's so many cars that sit around and they do very, very low mileage. So for example, we're working with an NHS trust at the moment to try and rationalize their fleets, and they had 10 pool cars to provided for their day shift and a further 10 cars provided for their night shift, and so they had 20 cars to provide. So what we've we've reduced the cars from 20 cars to 15 cars, and only allowing the day shift access to the vehicles during the day and the night shift. So it's a win-win in the fact the number of cars, overall cars, has gone down. The number of cars that people have access to has gone up, and yet, it's, and so that's what we're allowing people to do, and to rationalize their fleets. And then if they choose to share that fleet with the public or their staff, they can generate a revenue stream from those vehicles as well to offset the cost of the vehicles.
Superb. Yeah, so you're properly sweating that asset. And for people who don't necessarily have the funding to be able to buy a private vehicle of their own, that increases the number of mobility options that are available to them. Should they need multiple occupancy, should they need substantial cargo space and so on. So that's quite exciting. And certainly from my vehicle retrofitting projects that I've been involved in, like diesel to electric and so on, typically you're looking at saving about 5 tons of CO2 at least through chassis reuse. So by eliminating the need for more new vehicles, you're eliminating at least 5 tons of CO2 per vehicle. I mean, that said, the embodied energy of steel will remain high, but the embodied carbon will come down as we start using genuinely green hydrogen, none of this derived from fossil fuel polluting nonsense, to displace coal in steel production, but that's going down a completely different route. So yeah, that's quite interesting. But in terms of, say you were a fleet manager listening into this and you were intrigued about the opportunity to, well, not only help your local community, but to make more money out of your existing fleet, how would that work then? So presumably there's some sort of telemetry box that is added to the vehicle. How would they go about getting that? What would it entail, and how would it look to the end user as well?
I'll let Joe answer that one. So since I've spoken too much already.
So fleet managers and B2B users have got a very simple process to get in touch with us. What we do, our team will come out, analyze the fleet, and then install, as you say, what we call a quick start box. So that quick start box plugs into the OBD port. That then enables drivers to book and access that vehicle on demand. So you don't have to mess around with keys. A lot of NHS trusts and councils that we work with have got walls, like 10, 20 feet walls full of keys from head to toe, and a person has to manage all that. All that issue goes away. And by enabling those vehicles to be shared amongst employees, the key to that is enabling those employees to access them whenever they want. So what drivers do is they turn up to the vehicle, they book the vehicle on the app, super straightforward, turn to the vehicle, connect to that vehicle via Bluetooth, unlock the vehicle, and off they go. There are a number of different security measures that we put on top, things like facial recognition to know that the right person is getting in the vehicle. It's very important from an insurance perspective that you know who's driving the vehicle. Damage inspections, one of the big things that fleet managers tend to find is the big barrier to letting somebody into your vehicle is what happens if they damage it. How can I prove that it was them? Drivers who access vehicles have to take photos of all sides of the vehicles. But I suppose the main thing that we do is we always learn from what we're doing. The big key premise of hiyacar is that we want to reduce vehicles, and the only way we're going to do that is by making the experience better and better. So, for example, with one NHS trust we worked with them, they had a big issue with people booking a vehicle and not actually picking it up. So they booked the vehicle, it'd be blocked out for 9 hours in the day, and they didn't actually need it. So what happened is somebody else in the organisation would then go and rent a vehicle, which would add additional cost. They'd probably end up renting an ICE vehicle, which would add additional emissions to the overall organisation. So simple things like actually working with a fleet manager to understand what they need meant that if somebody doesn't pick up a car up within 90 minutes, that booking now gets cancelled, and that vehicle is then available. So rather than that person who needed a vehicle going off and renting an ICE vehicle, they can now use that EV vehicle. So yeah, it's a pretty straightforward process, just installing a box and onboarding users, but there are a lot of different mechanics behind that allow us to really increase that utilisation.
Oh yeah, never underestimate the amount of effort it takes to do the kind of software side of these things. But in terms of the physical presence of your car club, it's, if you were to kind of put all of the physical possessions that you have in a big warehouse versus the likes of a conventional car club, it would be lots of tiny little boxes versus an entire kind of sea of cars, I suppose. So yeah, it's just quite interesting. That's why I thought that you were a valuable company to kind of bring onto this discussion as well about how can we use existing vehicles more efficiently. And of course, bonus points if those vehicles are fully electric, so that we're compliant with with air pollution regulations and noise pollution regulations as well. It just makes particularly urban areas that much more enjoyable. But without any further ado, I suppose we better start kind of decreasing the size of these alternative mobility solutions. So all other panelists, please do switch on your mics and your cameras, and we'll start talking about bikes and e-bikes. So first up, I'd said about kind of rentable bikes and e-bike provision within the faster project regions. So that's the rural northwest of Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Republic of Ireland. And we did actually reach out to some of the key stakeholders who are doing this, but unfortunately they're too busy being busy and successful to be able to join us today. So that's a bit of a shame. However, as industry consultants, Grace and Beth, it'd be great to get your thoughts on some of the leading examples you've seen, not just within those regions, but potentially, heck, why not worldwide? Who's kind of leading the charge when it comes to bike and e-bike rental, and why? What do you like about those particular schemes? So if we start with Beth first, and then Grace, would be interested to hear your top picks after that.
Yeah, oh, that's a big question. I think one area that we're particularly interested in at the moment at Cenex is learning from a lot of areas in the global south, where actually three-wheeler and two-wheeler use is higher than car use. So recently we've been speaking to people in Kenya, the Kenyan government, and their three-wheeler, motorcycle and autocycle vehicle park is at 46% compared to 34, I think, for four-wheel cars. And so it's really interesting to see what we can learn from those countries about how these vehicles are used, often with infrastructure that is far less developed than ours. So one of the arguments about micro vehicles is that the infrastructure isn't good enough. That's not always the real necessary thing. It's actually about sharing, how you're sharing and who you're sharing that infrastructure with. And also the commercial use of those vehicles in those countries as well is really interesting. So seeing very high mileage, battery swapping, and all sorts of interesting operational methods. I think in the UK, there's some really great examples all over of e-scooter and e-bike sharing schemes, and perhaps Grace can talk a bit more about some of the ones she's been involved with, but I wouldn't want to pick favourites really.
On that note, Grace, what do you think about the leading examples?
Yeah, thanks, Beth. I think just to take a step back on the wider point, I think it's really interesting how, generally society works in sort of circles, and we're going back to looking at bikes when actually they were on the roads before four-wheeled vehicles, which is really fascinating. The global south point that Beth made is really, really important. It's almost, looking at those examples, they work so exceptionally well there, and they are so highly used. How can we take those examples and apply them to areas closer to home, for example, the UK and Europe? I think in terms of really standout schemes, one that really comes to mind on the continent is particularly in Germany, in Berlin. If anyone's been to Berlin very recently, you'll have seen a very large amount of shared e-bikes and e-scooters that the locals use and tourists use, which is really wonderful. They're also really big on mobility hubs, so that's bringing all of these modes together, including shared cars as well, and allowing people to simply turn up to a hub and choose what mode of transport really suits what their trip needs are. Now, in terms of e-scooters and e-bikes, they've been exceptionally popular over there. Closer to home, particularly in Scotland, we can see some shared bike schemes, particularly over in Glasgow, really, really popular as well, which is wonderful. Down south in England, and I'm slightly biased because this is something I'm working on at the moment, the West of England e-scooter trial has been an incredible success. The trials that are happening down in England at the moment for e-scooters have really indicated to us how innovative technology can benefit sustainable transport. And the West of England trial, I think there's been about 14 million trips in the last 3.5 years, which is absolutely exceptional. So there's lots to be learnt further overseas and also closer to home as well. And I could probably talk for a long time about it, but I will pause there.
Well, I'll tell you what, if we have sufficient spare time at the end of this, we will definitely come back to that. And indeed, we will soon be covering the need for micromobility hubs and infrastructure provision. And no doubt Paul will be champing at the bit when it comes to infrastructure provision. But before we do that, obviously we've covered, actually, it was good to hear about sort of 2- and 3-wheelers from a kind of sort of motorbike-esque perspective there, Beth. So that was quite a good point. That's kind of in between your conventional four-wheeled vehicle and your e-bike. So it was nice to have that decreasing order of size that I'd promised our attendees this morning, and also e-scooters as well. We'll definitely come on to that. But with regards to bikes and e-bikes, so I mean, Jon, it's all well and good, say the car drivers, but you know, they're not for cargo, are they? Or are they?
Yes, very much. I mean, you know, I am somewhat biased in that. So at Zedify, we operate 98% of our delivery fleet, or our operational fleet, is pedal powered. Principally three-wheel, some two-wheel as well, and it really depends on the landscape. Urban landscape. We're a city operator, so we're in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Scotland, all the way down to Plymouth on the south coast in England. So we've got a broad view on different qualities of infrastructure and what we can do with bikes, really. But on a sort of on the larger scale of the sort of fleet, you know, we've got three-wheel bikes that will carry 250 kilos really quite happily. So they're as productive, if not more so, than a long wheelbase sprinter, because the vast majority of those are running around at best half full. We can move quicker, so where the cycling infrastructure, we can navigate through cities. So there's some reports, and this is an extreme case, let's be honest, but there's some reports that sort of say that actually a bike can be 60% faster around a city than a four-wheel vehicle can. That's not typical, that's an extreme, but these things are possible. So we're kind of really reaching the point where these pedal powered vehicles can be the sort of silent machine that's running the city. So, you know, from our perspective, yes, we're doing last mile deliveries and only mile deliveries, so that's displacing vans that would ordinarily be clogging up streets and neighborhoods. But moreover, from a micro mobility standpoint, so the project that Grace mentioned in Wecker in Bristol at the moment, I mean, we're on the verge of stepping in to run a large proportion of that. And the bit that no one really sort of thinks about is the tidal nature of bike and scooter share. So, you know, they all go one way in the morning and the other way in the afternoon. The problem comes when people go other places during the day and they end up all over the place. So you've got to get them to where the riders are going to be. That's what we're doing, you know, with our fleet as well, and making sure the batteries are charged. And for a fleet the size of Bristol, you know, that's thousands of movements and battery swaps a day that's happening, and no one really notices. And that's the beauty of something like a cargo bike, because they're silent and they disappear into the landscape.
Now, you raise a couple of good points there. Obviously, you know, the use of battery power to help to haul the driver the cyclist and 200 to 300 kilograms worth of cargo. So I'm just back from Cenex LCV, so well done, Beth, and your colleagues. It was yet again a hugely successful conference, always worth a visit. And there was quite a sizable micro mobility section, and there was discussion around e-bikes, including kind of cargo e-bikes or tandem e-bikes and so on. Some quite neat solutions that were there. And I understand at the moment that the regulations are that the motor is to be capped at 250 watts. So how do your staff, how do your cyclists / pilots / drivers / whatever you would call them when they're piloting riders, there we go, that's the one I'm looking for, thank you, because it is, you know, it is such a substantial vehicle in comparison to a conventional bike, I guess. You know, how do they find the limitations of the 250 watt motor? Is it a limitation, or is it actually plenty of power to do what they need to do, including in hilly cities, as you mentioned?
Could always do with more. You know, it tends to be battery life that gets hammered. So the 250, and I'm not the expert on this, so there may be someone more knowledgeable on the panel or listening that would have a better view on this, but it's 250 average, so you can spike so long as it levels off. So it tends to be that we can front load these things, and we're actually build our own bikes from a reliability and standpoint, supply chain standpoint. That's the point we got to, and so we've designed the bikes to suit what we need them for. And it tends to be that acceleration can be an issue if you're in traffic, which they are in traffic. So they're quick off the line, and will soon cap out at the 25 kilometers an hour, which personally I feel is probably too slow, because a lot of the cities are 20 miles an hour, so we're moving slower than that. It'd be better if we could keep up with the traffic, because then we'd be, dare I say it, less of a nuisance to those of us who view us in that way. So it's not really an issue, you know. On the quad bikes, some that have got 4 motors on them, you know, so moving people and goods around on these things, I mean, the technology is moving on all of the time, and it's not really an issue. I think it's more the speed that could be better dealt with.
Yeah, you're absolutely right with regards to the kind of 250 watt average. That came up in discussion at Cenex LCV as well, and I was pleasantly surprised to hear that is the case. So yeah, as you say, for actually getting off the line or tackling steep hills and things, that is not an issue, so that's good. But what also came up in conversation at Cenex LCV, and again was something I was going to say, and then the person I was speaking to beat me to it, we need to be upping the speed limit on e-bikes to 20 miles an hour, because then there is, you know, the motorist behind you has no business trying to overtake you, because you are doing the speed limit. You are not doing just frustratingly slightly below the speed limit. And then, you know, everything, all the traffic kind of keeps up with one another. And in terms of being 60% faster through a city, I mean, I can certainly concur. During my commuting days down south, I drove initially and then got my hands on an e-bike. And yeah, the e-bike was just as quick in rush hour traffic. So it doesn't surprise me at all that it could be quicker, especially if it's a bigger, bulkier vehicle carrying cargo. But I suppose that you've also raised the point about battery swapping, and of course the need for sufficient infrastructure. But Paul, we'll come on to how we keep those batteries charged first and foremost, because you've been waiting ever so patiently. So tell us more about your solution for charging e-bikes and other micromobility in urban areas and beyond.
Yeah, Solarcycle, well, our business started really earlier this year, working with our first client was NHS, 2 hospitals in the south. We've got a couple of pilot schemes running, and it really, exactly as you say, is the infrastructure. The hospital wanted to implement charging for e-bikes to encourage healthier, more active travel methods for coming to the hospital. They had approximately 25 cars for every parking space. So there was that kind of parking logistics issue they had as well. But really to put in, you know, into their existing bike shelters, to put in electric power or to provide electric charging for people to turn up on e-bikes was going to cost, you know, tens of thousands in trench works, groundworks, that kind of thing. And that's without, you know, the power on top and the ongoing charges and, you know, not knowing where that energy is coming from, etc. So it sort of started from a conversation with them and something we'd been working on already, which was, can you power an e-bike with solar? Which was an experiment by myself, you know, some years ago with these beautiful small batteries. Yes, it can be done. So we put the pilot scheme in. It came in at significantly less than the cost of them even installing and doing the trench works. And the beauty of it is you've got electric charging in a safe environment, protected shelter with a locked door on it. So e-bikes, which are obviously more valuable, can be parked in there and charged. And yeah, it's been big success. And we're talking to obviously lots of other organisations now that want to replicate what we've done there, as well as numerous hospitals as well.
Now, on that note, Jon, you mentioned that you're doing battery swaps during the day on your fleet. Presumably those swaps are taking place at the, it wouldn't really be a terminus as such, but you know, the kind of one outer extremity, or are they coming back to the depot, as it were, to get the swap done?
No, so the swaps we're doing are for the micromobility fleet. So these are the Voi tier scooters that are out there, but no, they're in situ. So we have banks of charges in our hubs. So we've always got, you know, a cyclical charge going on. We take the batteries out, do the swaps, bring them back. I mean, we are somewhat hamstrung by weight because these are dense things, and I think there's also health and safety around the number you can carry in a single, you know, vehicle without special protective sort of cases and such. But you know, typically we can carry 30 to 40 batteries out, depending on the size of the battery. So it's a really highly efficient way of doing it. The bigger problem is if you've got to move bikes around, That's difficult on a bike. That does require a van, frankly, but make it an electric van, not a piston one, you know. So,
oh, absolutely. Yeah. Incidentally, that's one of the things that annoys me about all the cycling championships that you see everyone using the cleanest form of mechanical propulsion, and they're being followed by big dirty diesel SUVs. Come on, we've got 300-400 mile range EVs already and ample charging infrastructure. Get with the times. But the point is that, you could possibly see why I came back to Jon there, Paul, because I'm thinking, here is a fleet that's needing to do regular battery swapping throughout the day. Here is a solution that is an off-grid charging solution that could be deployed virtually anywhere. If there are extremes of the routes where your riders could easily swap the packs out, and instead of having like a locker that it basically contains an entire e-bike, if it's little lockers that contain the swappable packs with chargers in them, I can see that working quite well. So I'm basically doing some pro bono business development work in the middle of a live webinar. Sorry, but it struck me as it's
a really interesting call. You definitely have a chat about that, Paul, because I mean, certainly when you've got London, for example, right? We're operating, all across central London. We have got hubs dotted around all over, but Bristol as well. I mean, if you look at the conurbation there, we've got stem mileage of 5 miles. That's 20-25 minute ride. If we could save that, that'd be hugely beneficial.
Yeah, so there we go. I think you've got each other's contact details. Who knows? It could be that this webinar has actually been one of the most productive from a business perspective that we've actually had. But yeah, I suppose on that note, we were kind of touching upon hubs of which charging infrastructure for e-bikes and other forms of micromobility would play a key role. But I suppose to come back to Grace first this time, and then Beth, in terms of micromobility hubs that you have seen that best support means of active travel / micromobility, again, give us some examples of what we would expect to see in those and why it works so well.
Yeah, of course. So a hub really isn't anything physical. It doesn't have to be. It can all be maintained by what's called geofencing. So technology actually preventing a user from going outside of some GPS limits. So micro-mobility hubs, particularly in the UK at the moment, if we have sort of the shared e-bikes and the shared e-scooters with a little computer on board, they can head towards what is a hub, and once they're inside those limits, they can park there. So it doesn't really require any infrastructure, which is brilliant because it's low cost to install anything. You don't need to necessarily. That does come with some problems, which technology is helping to clear up as time goes on. So, for example, GPS isn't particularly accurate in some places, particularly where there might be really tall buildings in large cities, for example. There can be some black spots in different areas as well, and that can cause some issues. Technology is improving, though, so that's getting much, much better. That can be improved slightly. So to give an indication to a user as to where they can park or pick up their vehicle, there can be some sort of demarcation on the ground. That decision is all up to the local authorities, very importantly, though. So when you're thinking about World Heritage sites, you might not want to put any paint on the ground, and that's where technology can really help with that. But then, of course, we can go to the sort of other side where real good physical infrastructure can be implemented. And these hubs can then also have different elements. So we can also have like physical docked charging stations, dependent on the sort of e-bikes and e-scooters that you're operating. You can also have shared cars there as well. You can have bus timetables, the live timetables that are there. And this is all helping one single person choose the best mode of transport and the most convenient mode of transport for them to take a trip. These can then be extended a little bit further, and you can bring in things for the community. So our parcel lockers are brilliant, and they're getting really popular now, which is excellent. And little cafes, pop-up shops, that sort of thing. So these micro mobility hubs can either be very, very small with 5 to 10 e-bikes or e-scooters in, or they can increase in size up to many more micro-mobility vehicles, but also including different modes as well. So it's very, very dependent on the location, the scheme, and what the people want as to what hubs can really work best for people in that area.
Very insightful. Beth, what would your thoughts be on decent micro-mobility hubs then?
Yeah, well, I'd start off by echoing what Grace was saying about a hub or a mobility hub or a micro mobility hub or any kind of transport hub. It is not necessarily about some built infrastructure, in a place. That it can be very much about the joined up planning of various transport services so that it starts to make sense to the user. And so we would see a really gold standard hub as where you've got that really joined up planning with public transport as well, because where micromobility starts to come into its own and be an incredibly useful form of transport from a particularly carbon reduction point of view, and being able to displace car use, is where we're linking up with public transport. We're letting people do the last bit of their journey or the first bit of their journey quickly so that they can get onto a bus or onto a train. And so where we see micromobility co-located with bus stops, train stations, that's where you start to see these really lovely hubs of activity and movement happening. And it is about selling and helping the users from a understanding and a behavioral point of view what multimodal transport means, because we talk about that in the industry and in the transport sector a lot. Or we want everybody to be using multimodal transport. Doesn't mean anything to most people on the street. It's complete nonsense. But trying to actually sell that concept of you don't need one large chunk of metal. You can use kids' car share, you can use a scooter, you can use a bus. You use the right tool for the right job. And we talked about that with the bikes as well, having the right tool for the right job. If it's a delivery bike or if it's a shared e-bike, they need to have different requirements so that they fit the job that they're doing. And yeah, so where we see that kind of really joined up approach to planning, I would just champion the Transport for West Midlands work that they've done around mobility hubs. Their prototype hub that used a very modular system, which allowed the concept that hubs could adapt to the area that they're going into, to the community that they're going into, and to the transport services that were required there. And they are in the process. I think the planners for the first hubs to go live in January, and there's been some really good work with the local community to understand what the needs are and how to link up those transport modes together. Yeah.
Excellent. Keith, you have reappeared. I presume there's some input from the hiyacar perspective with the mobility hubs.
Yeah, not so much the mobility hubs, but more the planning aspect of things. In terms of it's it's an area that we're working in quite closely with developers and planners to provide vehicles at developments to sort of reduce the reliance on privately owned cars, especially allowing people to have one car, but providing a sort of shared car to be that sort of fraction of a car that people need every now and again. And we've got one really interesting development called Calderwood, just about 20 miles west of Edinburgh, where they're developing it out, where the developer has actually provided an electric vehicle themselves, and we just provide them with the back office for providing the shared vehicle. And certainly we've had it in for about 8 months now, and over the last 2 or 3 months it's actually washing its face now. So the developer's actually making a return on the investment of providing the vehicle, and it's becoming very popular.
Very good to know. And actually, just on the topic of kind of cars again, that reminds me, in addition to what hiyacar does with fleet kind of car club provision, if you wish, I recently discovered that Zoom EV is a company that allows you to lease your own household electric vehicle to others in the vicinity. So again, circling back to the kind of Gen Z and 55% of Gen Z being interested in sharing mobility solutions. If you do own your own EV, there are platforms out there that, provided that the EV is less than 8 years old, I think it's probably like less than 100,000 miles. There'll be caveats. Then you can lease those out. Interestingly, I couldn't do that with my EV because it's over 8 years old and it's still going strong. But yeah, there we go. Beth, yes.
I just wanted to quickly come in and say on that we're working on a project, and I'm working with Keith on this, but looking at not only that peer-to-peer sharing of your own car, but also your own charge point. So just knowing that the audience that's there that might be interested, there's a number of organisations out there. Co-Charger is one that's involved in the project that we're doing. But it's a really interesting proposition, particularly in rural areas. And it comes down to that idea of that share and use these resources effectively and efficiently, rather than having to spend a lot of money on having all our own things. We actually can be a lot more efficient about it.
Oh, absolutely. And I think we've had Joel on a previous webinar as well. And I'm glad you mentioned the Co-Charger, and I'm even happier to hear that they're involved in that project too, because obviously they're very good at what they do. But yeah, totally. If people who had a suitable driveway, in other words, there was an adjacent space at which someone else's car could come in and plug in, if everyone who has a charge point and a double driveway put their charge point on Co-Charger and listed when it would be available, obviously, it's your charge point. If you need it, but you can block out the times you need it and then make it available outside of those hours. That vastly improves the charging infrastructure right across the UK, and that's whether or not the laggard local authorities like it or not. Particularly, I would say that would be quite good within the FASTA project in Northern Ireland, where there is a distinct lack of on-street charging infrastructure for people without driveways. There are numerous solutions available. They're all being kind of assessed on a case-by-case basis, I understand, but it's Department for Infrastructure that owns all the roads and pavements rather than the local authorities, and it's this whole back and forth. And I think possibly Mark McCall from the Electric Vehicle Association of Northern Ireland is on the call today, and if he is, he will be nodding away at his desk. It's like, yeah, this is what we've been up against. So yeah, the likes of Co-Charger and sort of peer-to-peer home charge point sharing, and extending that to like business depot charge point sharing, that would be our office charge point sharing. That is profoundly positive, because that just opens up that network, and we're not expecting you to get access to it for free. Of course, you would be paying for the electricity you use, plus a little bit to go towards the upkeep of the charge point in general. But yeah, really good point, Beth. I do like the fact that that's been raised here as well, in terms of shared mobility and the kind of wider shared infrastructure that's needed for that. I suppose one aspect of shared infrastructure, which is rather important for e-mobility, is cycle paths / micro-mobility paths. And on that note, John, of course, you said that you are operating substantial delivery e-bikes in Edinburgh, I believe in conjunction with a very large, very well-known courier. I don't know if that's public domain or not, but yeah. So it's DPD, if I recall correctly.
And every actually in Edinburgh.
Oh wow, there we go. Yeah, goodness me, fingers in many pies. But yeah, so I know that, let's just put it this way, Edinburgh's new cycling infrastructure is controversial, not because it exists, but because, have you seen it? Oh my God. So yeah, I mean, you can tell my thoughts on it. In fact, just as an example, my other half and I, we were coming out of Waverley down, it's that kind of back entrance to Waverley that goes through the arch where Euan McGregor gets hit by the car in train spotting and then just laughs and runs away. Yeah, but just at that point, there's a big junction opposite the new St James's Quarter shopping centre. And as a pedestrian, it takes literally about 3 to 5 minutes to cross that road. And the entire time you are at extreme risk of being hit by a bike or a car, because you're dealing with roads, but also with a cycle path that just stops randomly and is very piecemeal. And then Leith Walk, which is a perfectly straight road, is a freaking slalom. So anyway, yeah, I've put my cards on the table, but from your personal experience and your rider's personal experience, is that, am I being harsh? Is that respectable charging infrastructure? I can tell with my day-to-day business, cycling infrastructure, and if not, how should it have been done? What should have been improved?
Well, I think we'd always advocate for sort of a coherent approach to it. And it's not unique to Edinburgh or that bit of Edinburgh. Here in Cambridge, which is where I live, I mean, it's a patchwork, and we're supposed to be the cycling city, right? But we'd always advocate for it. It's interesting. We're looking at DPD data in Edinburgh. I was up there last week, and you can see at peak times of the day the traffic slowing our bikes down, because certainly with the trikes, if there's no infrastructure, we're sat in the traffic. And so the dwell times between drops do increase at certain times of the day because everyone's in their cars going home or whatever it's going to be. So we'd always be advocating for more infrastructure, obviously, and only where it's sympathetic. Where our hub is in Edinburgh is sort of round the corner from Haymarket. So we're sort of where they're putting the cycle infrastructure in, that's our sort of entry point to the city. So actually it's a really helpful spot for us. But if you go somewhere out of Scotland, Waltham Forest, for example, which, you know, with their Mini Holland scheme, which if no one's sort of familiar with that, is well worth a visit and a walk around Waltham Forest these days, because certainly if you're a cyclist, it's dream world. But on a trike, it's not, because it's not been considered that a bike might be wider than a set of handlebars at some point. So actually in Waltham Forest, we use much more of the 2-wheel fleet than we do the 3-wheel fleet, because the 3-wheel fleet won't fit on the cycle paths that they've put in, or some of the cycle paths that they put in. That's not fair to say none of them. So I think in terms of, you know, if local governments are investing in infrastructure, they should have a vision for how they want their infrastructure used. You know, if they do want freight and things being moved around their cities on cargo bikes, which hopefully everyone would, just think about how that's going to work, and then how those tracks interface with the rest of the traffic as well, like you said, because we don't want to be a nuisance for pedestrians. Pedestrians should be number one priority on any street anywhere. My personal view, not necessarily the view of Zedify, but, you know, and then bikes are very, very close second, but we certainly shouldn't be a nuisance to anyone. So
there we go. Basically, in a roundabout way, if you are a business on Leith Walk, sorry, that road's getting dug up again for the 3rd time at some stage, just to try and get decent cycling infrastructure in there. But no, on a serious note, I suppose there are some cities and countries around the world that have been incredibly successful with micromobility, including cargo bikes and so on. And of course, the Netherlands springs to mind. But I suppose we'll have a bun fight over who wants to answer this one. But leading examples of cargo bike friendly infrastructure around the world, and ideally a bit closer to home as well. Go. Who wants to go first? Oh, Beth, go for it.
I have one, if I'll dive in there. And I just want it slightly addresses one of the questions in the chat box as well from Peter. So we a while ago now we're doing some work with Sofia in Bulgaria, which is not somewhere that people often hear about when it comes to micromobility or infrastructure, but actually was a city that was one of the first in Europe to put in place regulations around e-scooter and actually tender the service rather than have the operator come along and set up shop without any regulations in place. But one of the things that they did was to allocate 200 parking spaces to e-scooter and micromobility parking. So they took the cars out of them and said they're no longer for cars, these are for small vehicles. And it was very unpopular with car drivers, but seemed to work really well for the scooter and the micromobility users in the city, and has continued to do. And I think this addresses one of the issues around pavement parking and pavement use, and that idea of the being, you know, pedestrians being the most important road users because they are the most vulnerable. Where and from my perspective, a behavioural point of view, which is my core area, if we're asking people to pick up a vehicle on the pavement and take it onto the road, that's very dangerous. They also, it doesn't tell them that vehicle should only be on the road. It tells them that it can be on the pavement. And so it sends all sorts of mixed signals and is not a great way of providing parking infrastructure. So when we talk about infrastructure, we're always, a lot of the time, focusing on the routes, and which are really important to get right. But we also need to think about some of those little points and consider human behavior within the planning that we do, because the logic doesn't always match up with the human behavior. So that would be my example.
Really good insight. And I suppose with those parking spaces as well, you can kind of do double-decker storage spaces or potentially even higher than that, such as the comparative lightweight and, you know, handleability, I suppose, of micromobility, similar to the racks that you see in railway stations and so on, if that's a fair analogy.
If you wanted to, but even without that, you still fit, you know, 4 times the number of vehicles in one spot. So you're still helping more people with one spot.
At least for sure. Yeah. Certainly when I was in Oxford, because I went to Oxford, I did my PhD there. Don't mention it very often. You're saying about 4 kind of e-bikes per kind of rough parking space. Trust me, we tried to go for the record. There were a lot of us, and it was like wherever there is a bare piece of metal, that bike is getting locked onto it. Sometimes in the excitement, someone else's bike would get locked onto someone else's bike, and that would be slightly annoying if you were the recipient of that. Anyway, going back actually to micromobility hubs, I do apologize, Paul, I believe it was yourself who had raised a very good point for the agenda, and I apologize if it was actually John who said this. So training and maintenance are often overlooked with regards to the rollout of micromobility. And you'd raised a really good point about how micromobility hubs could potentially be used to address that. So tell us more. It may not have been you.
It wasn't me.
Oh, shoot. Was it yourself, John?
No,
someone definitely did. Oh, who was it? One of you did. Oh, well, so basically someone had raised a really good point about how hubs could be used as access points in the assistance of shifting towards cargo bikes and being more confident in their usage as well. So those micromobility hubs where there is physical infrastructure there could be kind of training days. I suppose there are many cities across the UK where you get, for example, bike repair shops. And in fact, I was speaking to... or sharing the stage yesterday with Shufta Anwar from Women on Wheels in Glasgow. Don't know if you've come. Yeah, nodding away there. Absolutely fantastic what she's doing. She's basically teaching women how to ride a bike who've never been taught how to ride a bike before. And the take up, even in biting cold weather, has been phenomenal. And who'd have thought that so many people are just secretly kind of hiding in their house thinking, I'd like to cycle, but I'm just a wee bit embarrassed about learning. Like there's huge opportunities to use these micromobility hubs as a, as I say, where there is physical infrastructure, as this massive, kind of neon lit, bright opportunity to learn and engage and learn some new skills, not just how to ride these machines, but also how to maintain them. It's a great point. So whoever that was who raised that question that I tacked on there, thank you, and apologies for forgetting to write down your name, because it was a very good point. So yeah, we've already covered obviously the need for cycling infrastructure to cover cargo bikes as well, lest we end up with kind of more traffic on the road, which is what we're trying to avoid. Because obviously if you're slowing down bigger vehicles, you're adding to congestion, whereas if you can just nip through properly designed cycling infrastructure, everyone gets to where they need to go as quick as possible. But I suppose it's important to cover some interesting statistics, if anyone has any to hand, on typical sort of uptake of active travel. And I suppose actually, Grace, you've already covered the take up in the southwest, something like 14 million journeys in the last 3.5 years, which is phenomenal. But in terms of kind of take up of other faster project region, ideally, if anyone's aware of anything that's happening in Republic of Ireland, again, we did invite panelists from Republic of Ireland. Unfortunately, they couldn't make it, but general uptake on cycling, bike hire, e-bike hire, as soon as that's put in, and any reduction in traffic use as a result. Any kind of winning examples, again, hands up if you've got any straight off the top of your head, and we'll cover those, because it's great to hear about these. Oh, I think everyone's too shy. Go on, Grace.
I can't be too specific with where, although I'm doing a little bit of work at the moment in Ireland, and generally it looks like that where there has been any sort of shared bike or e-bike scheme, of which there's now becoming many more, the modal shift from cars to bikes tends to hover around 30%, which is really exciting. That does tend to fluctuate between region and of course seasonality as well, but that's where that's sitting, which for those people who thought that these modes were going to be the end to cars, why aren't they replacing all of them, that's actually a very good number. And what it does, particularly for journeys that are below the 2 kilometer mark, it allows that person to not take out their car that day, which is brilliant, saves them money, saves them fuel. Maybe it means they don't even need to own a car in the first place, which these days is extremely expensive. But aside from the sustainability benefits, there's also health and well-being benefits as well. These tend to get overlooked. even again, taking it back to e-scooters, where there's quite a few shared schemes in England at the moment, we see a lot of people commenting that they feel safer traveling on an e-scooter rather than walking. So a lot of people also talk about the people going from walking to a battery powered mode. It happens, absolutely. It's human behavior. I've spoken to a lot of women in university cities who, rather than one in particular was traveling to, I think it was rowing practice at 5 a.m. in the morning. And she said, thank you for allowing me to use a shared e-bike and shared e-scooter, because I feel safer traveling in dark hours a little bit faster than I would walking. Buses aren't operating at that time in the morning. She said, I just feel so much better going a little bit faster on my journey in that morning. So there's lots of benefits around that, which is really exciting if you dig a little bit deeper into the data.
Awesome. Yeah, actually, from a safety perspective, that is so true. I think definitely you should have a chat with Kate Tyrrell at ChargeSafe, who's trying to improve the safety and accessibility of charging infrastructure. Because in terms of like that holistic model, yeah, I just love the point that you've raised about how it actually does improve safety. You've got a machine that can outrun any aggressor. And it does remind me of something I saw when I was on holiday in Barcelona, where they've got very good active travel provision. That said, John, I'll need you to confirm if their cycle lanes are quite wide enough for cargo bikes or not. But they're possibly on the bubble. But you know, it's that proper kind of segregated, like a mini road sort of thing that they've got going on. And there was a young woman on an e-boat, you know, like a shared e-scooter, which was proper, like, you know, heading along, like it gets up to some speed. And there was some old guy, I don't speak Spanish, but he was clearly catcalling her. And she just kind of, you could tell as she went past, she was kind of thinking about it and went, you know what, I'm not taking that. Turned around, went back. You have never seen someone tear into someone verbally like that. And again, I didn't speak Spanish, but it was just like, that is poetic justice, because she knew she could tell them where to go and then get out of there as quick as possible. It was like, yes, don't put up with that. Should never have happened in the first place, but absolutely call them out on it. So that was awesome. So yeah, that all just kind of, there's all these things that, you know, as a guy you don't tend to think about, but genuinely from a safety perspective, the speed, the nippiness of those machines is genuinely you've opened my mind there. Genuinely, that's a brilliant bit of insight. So I suppose it'd be interesting to get some statistics on the economics of it as well. Coming back to yourself very briefly, John, because of course you're working with couriers who would traditionally have diesel vans, or indeed DPDs going huge on electric vans, as we know. But one would assume that if the motor size, the overall vehicle weight is that much less, and you've got the rider injecting some pedal power too, what are the sort of typical savings that you would have from sort of cargo logistics by going down the e-bike route versus a van?
Well, it's kind of night and day different in terms of capex for a start. I mean, because you know, an electric van typically £50,000 probably, an off-the-shelf cargo bike, even one of the bigger ones, a quad or a big trike, is you're getting change out of 15 probably. Because we're making our own, we can probably halve that again. So, you know, over the lifetime, it's hugely cost effective. Charging it, I mean, it costs pence a day, really. We pay our riders well. They all get a real living wage minimum. So there is performance related bonus on top of that. So if they're going out, they're expected to maintain a certain productivity over the time. And then if they do better, then they earn better. So in terms of sort of us displacing owner drivers in the market, we can tend to be there or thereabouts competitive, bearing in mind that we're, you know, aim to be a profit-making business and making some headway into that. So yeah, I mean, in terms of cost saving, it is significant.
And I suppose as well, Paul, you've already alluded to the sort of tens of thousands of pounds of grid connections that you can potentially save if an existing premises is right on the bubble with regards to its its grid capacity versus installing your solar chargers. But do you have any kind of case studies of the economics of using your solution and the money that can be saved? And that includes versus using private cars or even public transport.
Not yet. No, sorry, Euan.
That's okay. Sorry. Threw you in there.
I mean, it's about CO2 savings really, rather than actual financial savings. So
absolutely,
you know, it's a zero carbon charging infrastructure. So where even using e-bikes is, you know, more efficient significantly. Charging them with solar is far more so. But yeah, in terms of actual financial savings, it is about the capex cost at the beginning. It's much cheaper to put it in, but then you have some control over rising energy costs. And I suppose, you know, one of the things we do talk about is, as hundreds of e-bikes are turning up at these organizations, you know, take the NHS for example, you know, hundreds of bikes turning up and charging, that's going to have a cost. Whereas, you know, charging with solar, it won't be impacted. It's the same cost, you know, however many bikes turn up to a limit.
Brilliant. And yeah, I totally agree on the CO2 savings. I wonder how long it's going to be before the more notorious tabloids switch from saying, oh, EVs are coal-fired cars to, oh, coal-fired e-bikes, how dare you. It'll be that level of petulance, I suppose. So it's nice to be able to have 100% solar-powered infrastructure and just go, sorry, what's that? I can't hear you over the copious amounts of sunshine that's charging my e-bike right now. On that note, I'm going to very quickly take one of the questions, because it was an excellent question. In fact, I think possibly you've already answered it. Yes, you have. Oh, there we go. But it's worth reading out. So Peter McCree, one of your questions that you've raised today, are you considering installing a fixed battery within your solar charging shelters to utilize the solar energy when not required during the day? Paul, you've answered yes. It includes energy storage for about 24 hours worth of charging. So that's brilliant. Yeah, excellent. Totally makes sense, of course. But yeah, the ability to kind of export excess on a particularly sunny day, should there be any kind of ropey grid connection that could be connected to, would be quite an interesting little addition to that. Although it's a case of kind of every little helps, as opposed to like a multi-megawatt charging hub or energy storage battery that can literally keep the grid stable if a gas-fired power plant trips or something like that. But even still, yeah, interesting to see that that's the design that you've got already. So I suppose the final thing before we motor on and cover some of the other micromobility options and alternative transport solutions that are out there, and then take more of your questions, what could and should governments be doing to regulate and support bikes, e-bikes, e-scooters, etc. successfully? We've already discussed increasing the speed limit to 20 miles an hour. We've already discussed maybe being a bit more lenient with the maximum motor power when dealing with cargo bikes. But what other tidbits of wisdom would you give to any government individuals listening just now? Open question to the entire floor.
Yeah, I can jump in. Particularly in terms of micro mobility, and I'm specifically talking about e-scooters, because of course at the moment the UK government has not progressed particularly well with pushing through legislation. The Irish government, on the other hand, is in progress, which is fantastic. But what I would say is, from working in the industry in the last 4 years, communication is really key. The micromobility industry has grown so quickly. There's a lot of jobs reliant on it. There's a lot of people who rely on it for their own travel purposes. It's very clear from a lot of research that has been undertaken that people really do rely on shared e-bikes, shared bikes, and shared e-scooters now for their day-to-day transport to their own jobs, or to medical appointments, or to social occasions. So in the UK, we're still slightly unaware as to what is happening after May 2024. So a little bit more communication on that would be really appreciated to anybody listening on that.
Well, this is being recorded, so feel free to send it to those decision makers as well immediately after this. And that goes to everyone who's watching live just now. Speaking of which, lovely to have you as always, of course. Great to have so many attendees with us today. But I suppose, yeah, actually, before we move on, Keith, you've very quietly put in the chat there a stat according to Como UK 2022 that's just blowing my mind. So go for it. Tell us about the advantage of car club vehicles versus private in this sense.
Well, it's just that's the statistic that comes out of the Como UK customer survey. So, you're asking the question, are privately owned cars the way to go? And I think we've really got to look at, the whole car ownership model as being wrong these days, and moving over to sort of shared vehicles. Going back to your question about what can governments and local authorities do about their fleets, I think actually engaging and running a pilot project on actually sharing their pool car fleets, and with local authorities not actually going into a lot of local authority staff not actually going into their offices at the moment. In order to pick up one of these pool cars, they've actually got to go to their offices to pick up the car. I think there's a huge opportunity to actually disperse a lot of these vehicles closer to where their staff actually work. And the councils actually have all this data in terms of where their staff actually work and who's costing them huge amounts in terms of grey fleet miles, and actually do a bit of analysis around that and actually start moving the vehicles closer to where they are and putting them at charging points closer to where they are, so those vehicles can be shared within the community outside working hours. I just think that I think running a pilot project somewhere along those lines has to happen.
A really good point. And that stat, by the way, was that in London, each car club car replaced 29 private cars, which is mind-blowing. The results will probably be somewhat different in rural areas, and someone did ask an amazing question that we will come back to in the Q&A, because that's a really good point you've raised. Beth, you had your hand up there.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one quick thing about what governments and local authorities should do. I'll not go into what national government needs to do in order to get micromobility industry flourishing and growing and doing everything that it can, because Grace has touched on that. But in particular respect to local authorities and those working within sort of charging infrastructure area, I think it's very important, and a lot of the work we do at Cenex through things like the Levi program in England is trying to broaden your horizons there, and it's very easy to become very focused on, I need to deliver public charging infrastructure. This is a really important thing, and it is an incredibly important thing. But as we talked about, in order to reach our climate goals and make the changes that we want to make for the environment and for our local communities, we do need to move towards multimodal transport, people using the right tool for the right journey. And in order for that to happen, local authorities need to be thinking in that way. So when it comes to your planning around charging infrastructure, it might not be that relevant to the specific thing you're doing, but at least sit and have a think about whether or not you've really considered whether you're enabling your residents to access many different forms of transport through the work that you're doing. That would be my ask.
Great shout. And again, this has been recorded, and I hope that everyone watching this who is a decision maker will take note of that. So I'm aware that we are fast kind of hurtling towards the end of this webinar, and we've still got a couple of bits to cover. We have conveniently already covered e-scooters to a decent degree, but there is, well, of course, there's the pros and cons that we need to discuss, and the cons recently have been that e-scooters have been banned from some forms of public transport. There have been numerous thermal incidents, shall we say, with the batteries. Now, as the resident electrochemist, I'm more than happy to talk through this, but if anyone's got any insight on this and how that situation can be resolved, feel free to jump in before I make this the Euan's electrochemistry show. I don't want to rant on too much when I have so many insightful panelists in front of us just now. Anyone want to take that?
I can, sorry, just very briefly. So a lot of the battery issues we're seeing are predominantly coming from those privately owned vehicles that have been purchased for very cheap off Amazon from overseas. And I know that there's quite a lot of local authorities also looking into what some operators have called a long-term rental. So this is where an e-scooter can be sort of, it's developed by the operator, so it's very similar to the ones that you see on a shared scheme, and it can be taken home and you pay a monthly fee and you can use that as you like, as if it was your own private e-scooter. That takes away a lot of the concerns as to the quality of the battery. The person at home is also given a really good safety briefing as to how you charge it, how often you charge it, and where it should be charged as well. So there are things being done, but of course there are a significant amount of dodgy batteries being purchased online at the moment.
Absolutely. We don't have time to go into the level of dodginess that there is out there, but as someone who's dissected some of these batteries in the lab, including one that was actually had the brand name Ultrafire, and the logo was a flame, and my electrochemistry colleagues and I opened this thing and we just creased ourselves laughing because it was so badly made. Like genuinely, there is some incredibly poor quality stuff out there within e-mobility. If, as you say, it's the kind of Amazon, Alibaba sort of stuff, but the stuff that goes into electric cars, the quality of the batteries there are meticulously, it's like military grade quality. Basically, they are so strict, and there's absolutely no way that the batteries that you get on, an e-scooter that set fire on a train in London or whatever it was in the news recently, there's no way that those same cells would make it into an electric car or van or anything like that. Incidentally, when I was at Cenex LCV, there was a really promising looking e-bike solution, and I said, "What batteries have you got?" And they showed me the pack, and it said LiPo on it. And they were like, "Oh, that's the one that's non-flammable, isn't it?" And I said, "Mate, I wouldn't even leave that in direct sunlight." So yeah, there's definitely a bit of learning that needs to be done. And John, I don't know what batteries you're using, and I won't get you to divulge too much technical sensitivities just now, but it's worth having a chat with the likes of MEP Technologies, which is the UK's own battery pack manufacturer based up in Dundee. They are chemistry agnostic, but they test everything thoroughly before they are prepared to make it into a battery pack, and they specialize not just in full-size electric vehicles, they're like cars, vans, and so on, but also e-mobility solutions. So there could be some interesting opportunities there for your locally produced battery packs. But I suppose, sorry.
No, I'm saying thanks. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no worries, no worries. So I suppose we are continuing our kind of decreasing, our shrinking of the size of vehicles. And sadly, we were going to discuss deliveries by drone, but the company that's working in the Faster Project region of the Highlands of Scotland to do drone deliveries to the islands, sadly, wasn't available to attend. But when I was speaking to the panelists before we went live today, Grace, you said that you're aware of Skyport's operations and Project Kalis. So again, to save it from just being me ranting on, please do tell us everything you know.
Yeah, I think this drones are particularly interesting because the industry themselves, they say, oh, they'll be here in 5 years, they'll be everywhere in 5 years, and then that 5 years keeps getting said every single year. But no doubt that there's been some excellent trials that have taken place. I know a little bit more detail about the one based out of Oban with the NHS. I think that happened in 2020, actually, with medical supplies going over to the Isle of Mull. Absolutely fantastic. So that was very lightweight freight being taken over to the island using drones. So it meant that, separate ferries, very, very carbon intensive ferries, were not needed to take those supplies over. So that's, in all honesty, as far as my knowledge goes. However, we are seeing a lot more companies in the industry really start to look at the ability for drones to be used for not only freight transport, but also people as well. And for those who are working in the industry, you may have seen a couple of years ago, human carrying drones were tested in Singapore, I believe it was. Now, I don't think we're going to see those in the near future, although I'll eat my hat if we do. But it does show that technology really is advancing, and if they are going to be of benefit to how people travel, that's still to be unknown. And again, we'll have to undertake a little bit more trials there. But there's definitely some use cases out there. It's just whether or not the benefits outweigh the cons.
Very true. And I knew there was a name of another project in Africa that I'd totally forgotten. So it's Zipline. That's doing blood delivery in Rwanda, and there's an amazing YouTube video that I can't remember the name of the YouTuber, but they've got a big channel, and they kind of go to interesting technological projects and have a look at them. And they did this video about Zipline. So go onto YouTube and check out Zipline Rwanda. There's an amazing video that details everything they do. But instead of being almost like helicopters with lots of little vertical blades, they've got what look like little planes, little micro-light planes. And because Rwanda's roads are so kind of tortuous, it would take hours for a blood bike to get samples or deliveries to where they need to be. Whereas obviously this can just take the direct route as the crow flies really quickly, and then can turn around and come back to base. And because, of course, it's like a plane, it doesn't come into land. They've got this genius high precision system. So it's kind of like a tripwire on the end of this these arms that come up like that as the plane's flying over. It catches the weight, the rear wing, and it just, oh, there we go. It just catches it like that. It's so precise. They then swap out the battery, put a fresh one in that's been fully charged, and away it goes again. Saving lives, undeniably saving lives. Incredibly cheap, incredibly efficient to do. So there are definitely use cases where drones make sense. And incidentally, those are really quiet drones as well. So it's not like the skies, even in very rural, remote areas, are going to be filled with this horrific din of buzzing drones. You know, it's actually quite easy on the ears, which is important because we don't want to ruin our tranquility. So the final thing before we go to Q&A, it would be remiss of us not to discuss how we kind of bring all of this together. So arguably the smallest size of alternative transport solution is something that's not really physically there. It's up in the cloud, and that is mobility as a service. So certainly I've got some thoughts on how that could be deployed straight away, right, without your connected autonomous vehicles and so on. But if anyone here has particularly good examples of mobility as a service that they'd like to discuss before, again, I prattle on a bit, please do stick your hand up and interject, because I'd love to hear other kind of successful use cases and thoughts on how mobility as a service could be a successful deployment. Last jazz, here we go. Okay, cool. Oh yeah, go on, Beth.
Yeah, I'll go in again just to say again that the Transport for West Midlands project around their mobilities and service app is really interesting and one to follow. They should be launching again in the new year. The big challenge around a fully functioning payment, booking, journey planning, mobility as a service system is the integration of the different transport modes. And I think a part of the issue is that there's so much that could possibly be done that it's very hard to get going sometimes, because you when you start to kind of think about, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to add into this as an option? Everybody wants to be involved, and then you end up with something that's immovable because it's too big and too complex. So it's a big challenge, but a real opportunity to make traveling easier for people.
Oh yeah, I mean, we have the pieces of the jigsaw already. We have phenomenal computational power. We don't necessarily need self-driving vehicles though, because what we already have, if you look at the kind of evolutionary steps, Ember's electric buses that run from Dundee to Edinburgh and Dundee to Glasgow and back on one charge, some of their stops are request stops, and you can book that right up until a few seconds before that bus is passing the motorway turnoff to go to that request stop, and that pings through to the driver and they go, oh, okay, and we'll reroute and grab you. So that's just a very kind of crude example of that kind of mobility as a service. But similarly, I was speaking to the Scottish Ambulance Service yesterday, and they were saying about their booking system and the accessibility needs of certain patients and the times they need to be at appointments, and how switching to electric vehicles might be a bit tricky in that regard because the range is good, but they might potentially need more. If you look at the likes of what large logistics fleets are using, that computational setup where they're saying these are our passengers, our cargo, whatever it is, this is where they are, this is where they need to go, and it uses this incredible neural network to figure out the most efficient routes for all of their vehicles to take. You could then factor in accessibility needs of patients so that you're not like overloading a particular passenger or patient transport vehicle that can only accommodate X number of wheelchair users, for example. You can accommodate the range of the vehicle, charging stops that are required, the chargers. There's information from chargers that you can get on ZapMap, WhatsApp, etc., that show the real-time availability. You can also filter by reliability as well. If you learn that some networks are a bit more ropey than others, some are a bit off the pulse, shall we say. So yeah, you can feed all of this in. And of course, when does the driver need a break? You can charge the vehicle during the driver's break at this particular location. And all of that gets fed in. And this is this amazing computational process, but that ultimately just gets fed through to a smartphone / sat nav sitting next to the driver. Right, this is where we're going. And if anything changes last minute, then it all just gets recalculated and it gets pinged straight through. Oh, okay, so we're not going here now. This can absolutely be done, and we have those pieces of software and we have those data feeds, but I don't think anyone's really put them together in such a holistic model. Certainly for the Scottish Ambulance Service, but there will be other examples where you can then, for a passenger going from point A to point B, including out in the sticks, it's like, okay, so you need a shared community bus or something like this, or community taxi to your nearest railway station, which can then take you to here. Oh, the train's delayed. Okay, replacement bus, whatever. Figure that one out. You can then rent a scooter to get to your final location, and it can join all of these dots, and you wouldn't need a car, and it would be faster than conventional public transport today. So I said I was reluctant to prattle on, but the pieces of the jigsaw are there, and that's what's really exciting. So it's actually the smallest kind of tiny little microchip that can bring together everything that we've just discussed and make public transport and shared mobility easier than private car use. Plus, there's a good chance you can get some work done on the way as well. So yeah, it makes it so much better than like the local bus that stops at every single stop and takes forever to get to where you need to go. We are talking ultra efficient, ultra streamlined shared mobility in the not too distant future. So on that note, rant over. We have some amazing questions coming through. So I'm going to start with Peter's other question. Does the panel consider that we're making a mistake by allowing e-bikes and scooters on the road or pavement with no restrictions? Pedestrians and the motorist is in danger of e-bike or e-scooters going from the pavement to the road and can both be unpredictable and a danger to other road and pavement users. Any thoughts on where's the most sensible place for e-mobility to be? And I know we did kind of cover pedestrian safety a little while ago, but any kind of further thoughts on this?
Yeah, I can jump in. So just to clarify, the pedestrian is always, I think, John, you mentioned this earlier, the pedestrian's always at the top of the hierarchy when it comes to using the street. Next down, in order of size, effectively, bikes, micromobility, and then cars. So cyclists, so cycling on the pavement and also using e-scooters on the pavement, particularly in the UK, is very much illegal. You're not allowed to do it. However, unfortunately, a lot of people do not know that. And the reason they are pushed onto those pavements is simply because they feel a little bit safer, because they don't want to be riding unarmored by lots of metal next to SUVs and very large cars, which are zooming past at more than 30 miles an hour next to them. The most appropriate place for cyclists and any other forms of micromobility are on segregated cycle/micromobility lanes. There's lots of research to say that a lot of the people that don't want to use bikes or micromobility is because there aren't infrastructure and they don't feel safe. So that's where they should be. But of course, that costs a lot of money to implement that absolutely everywhere. But I feel infrastructure sort of advertises itself, really. As soon as you put in some really good segregated cycling infrastructure, more people will want to use it, and that takes less people, or that takes people off their cars and onto that infrastructure, which means there's then more space for this infrastructure to be used. The majority of times, yes, I know some cyclists can act a little bit silly on the road, particularly if they're not confident on their road, but the motorist who's sitting in that big metal box is the primary danger to everybody around them. But there needs to be an understanding between those who are using the roads as well, to be conscious, and everybody needs to be aware as to what is going around them. And I'll just conclude by saying, yeah, infrastructure. I'm a cyclist. I'm also, unfortunately, a car driver. There needs to be a little bit more infrastructure for cyclists, that car users do not have to fear that a cyclist is going to come out of nowhere, and cyclists also do not have to fear that they are being squeezed in a very small space by car users.
Well said. And yeah, as was kind of discussed as well within the kind of comments on that question, there are certain food delivery drivers who are monsters on the road. I've certainly seen that a bit recently. I would hope that there could be some legislation that means that your employer has to take more responsibility over kind of training of road etiquette and safety, and that it would be the employer that would be hit with a fine should there be, malicious behavior that puts a pedestrian at risk or causes a collision with a vehicle that there's absolutely no way that they would have seen that coming, that mad behavior of just darting straight across the road at the traffic lights and so on. But I think that the key question, not least since the FASTA project covers some very rural regions, comes from Anne David. So you get the award for question of the day. So most of what has been discussed today is with regards to micromobility, of course, making use of EVs, etc. And that works well in urban areas. But what about the remote, non-urban, rural areas? How can we make alternatives to private car use work there? And again, this is a question that's open to all of the panel. Please fire in with your suggestions on this, because it is so crucial to make sure that people who are in more remote areas don't get left out.
Come in if nobody else is. Yeah. So we have at Cenex done a few projects in some different rural areas looking at potential options. I think, you know, you have to be slightly realistic that an e-scooter is not going to really take you down country roads, and that's absolutely fine. As I keep saying, it's the right tool for the right journey. There are some micromobility options that are viable, and we've come across various schemes like the Wheels to Work moped scheme, which is really interesting, providing mopeds to people living in rural areas to get to and from work and access jobs. And they are actively looking at electrifying the mopeds that they use and expanding their e-bike usage there. Infrastructure is a key one, in that there are potentially lots of like old rail routes and things that can be used to provide segregated infrastructure in rural areas. But those are complicated projects that often have multiple landowners, and it takes a long time to get anything done. But as always, it's a bit of a mix, and this is where things like car clubs and demand responsive transport really can benefit in rural locations, particularly because the financial business case for things like public transport or routed buses or large kind of operator-owned car clubs might not always fit. This is where peer-to-peer and hiyacars premise of making efficient use of vehicles that are already there and using demand responsive transport, that linking up the journeys that people need to take, not the route that the bus service thinks works, actually provide some real alternatives to car usage. So yeah, it's never a one size fits all, but there are options out there that we can continue to explore.
Absolutely, yeah. And as you say about the kind of optimizing of those kind of local transport routes, not what the bus company thinks makes sense. That's where the kind of mobility as a service comes in. And just kind of learning, I suppose it's part of the definition of machine learning, is as people use this micromobility app, or if you don't have a smartphone, phone up a call center that can put it through for you. You know, as the data of all of those routes and the days and times that those routes are taken all get fed through, then that really does optimize those existing services. And it could be that local bus services end up taking routes that might seem bizarre initially, but actually work for a greater amount of the population. So who knows? And it's not necessarily going to be a bus, is it? It could be a taxi. It could be a location of a solar-powered e-bike charging hub with e-bikes as well. Yeah, there's really exciting opportunities ahead, and it's all about data being worth its weight in gold, I guess, and learning from that data, learning from what people actually need. So as soon as the mobility as a service apps start to become more widespread, make full use of those, and we'll make sure that or just like naturally it will learn what you and your neighbors and your communities require, for sure. So yeah, I've just realized we are out of time now. This has been a thoroughly insightful session. I've got to say that out of all of the topics that we've discussed during the Faster project, this has been the one with which I've been least familiar, and it has been the most eye-opening. Definitely the panelists that we have today have all been brilliant. So please join us in thanking all of our panelists. We have Jon Williams, Beth Morley, Paul Stratford, Keith Stark, Grace Packard, and of course, Joe Parry as well. And a huge thank you to Donal Monaghan, as always, for keeping the show running in the background. We will be back in October. Quite sadly, you know, the Faster project is starting to come to an end. So we will have a series of roundup webinars looking at the impact of the Faster project and the learnings of the Faster project in each of the regions, starting in Scotland. That is on the 25th of October at 10 a.m. We will be joined by as many of the stakeholders as possible within the Scottish component of the Faster project, by which point hopefully all the chargers will be in the ground commissioned, and we will have some learnings from the actual use of them as well. So looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you once again for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thanks all.